A faint unease settles over certain corners of Australia, the kind that appears only when a landscape carries more stories than people are willing to repeat. Across this vast continent, scattered towns, abandoned sites, and near-silent regions form a hidden geography that many locals rarely mention. What stands out first is the contrast between Australia's bold, sunny image and these muted places where time seems to slow, colours fade, and an atmosphere of quiet distance replaces the usual coastal brightness. For Americans and Canadians, the discovery of these overlooked spaces often feels like entering a parallel version of the country, one where the noise of modern life falls away and the land speaks more loudly than its inhabitants. The initial reaction from visitors accustomed to more densely populated regions is a sense of scale that borders on surreal. Long, uninterrupted roads stretch through plains where wind-blown grasses ripple with a steady rhythm, and silence becomes almost architectural. Many North Americans remark on the calm but slightly disquieting emptiness, noticing how a single rusted fuel pump or a weather-beaten sign can dominate the scenery. A softness hangs in the air, formed by distant birdsong, the dry pulse of cicadas, and the muted crunch of red earth. What they observe most intensely is the shift in mood. Australia's forgotten spaces do not feel abandoned by accident. They feel suspended, as if holding their breath. Beneath these first impressions lies a deeper cultural pattern shaped by Australia's relationship with remoteness. While Americans often associate abandoned towns with economic decline and Canadians tie remote settlements to harsh weather or resource cycles, Australians tend to see such places as natural extensions of a landscape too large to tame completely. The cultural comfort with distance, solitude, and unfinished edges creates a subtle divide. What feels mysterious and haunting to outsiders may feel simply practical or unremarkable to locals. The pace of life in these forgotten areas mirrors older rhythms, slower steps, longer pauses, and a quiet acceptance of isolation. Even the architecture carries this mindset. Low buildings built for heat, simple facades, structures oriented toward function rather than embellishment. Yet the deeper differences become clearer through everyday generalizations. In many of these quiet regions, it's common to find a pub that hasn't changed its decor in decades, or a single general store that doubles as a community center, postal service, and informal meeting place. Visitors often encounter brief but warmly understated conversations, just a nod, a comment about the weather, or a practical warning about the next stretch of road. Animals drift across the outskirts of these towns with an almost ceremonial slowness. Kangaroos at dusk, parrots tracing bright arcs through otherwise dusty skies, or feral horses moving like shadows near the tree line. Outsiders frequently notice how these details create a sense of lingering history rather than neglect, reflecting patterns of life shaped by long distances and limited populations. Despite the quietness, these forgotten places subtly reshape the people who spend time in them. Many Americans find that stillness changes their internal tempo. Without crowds, traffic, or constant movement, thoughts stretch out differently. Canadians often sense a resemblance to their own remote regions, but with a drier, more enigmatic emotional climate. The vastness prompts reflection, the slow pace encourages contemplation, and the muted surroundings invite a kind of mental breathing space that feels rare in more populated settings. What initially appears eerie gradually becomes grounding, revealing why locals don't always speak about these areas. They are not secrets, but simply parts of the landscape that require no explanation. As the narrative moves deeper into these regions, the atmosphere shifts from initial curiosity to a more layered understanding of how forgotten spaces persist in Australia. The quiet becomes almost tactile, shaping the way visitors perceive distance, movement, and time. Many Americans note how the land seems to absorb sound, creating a sense that footsteps, engines, and voices dissolve more quickly than expected. Canadians often recognize a familiar emotional stillness, but here it feels warmer, dustier, and touched by a kind of ancient patience. The horizon stretches so far that even small changes like the sudden curve of a riverbank or the appearance of an old grain silo take on a symbolic presence, marking transitions that are felt more than seen. Cultural differences reveal themselves not through obvious contrasts, but through subtleties. In these forgotten areas, Australians often maintain a quiet respect for the land without romanticizing it. The practicality is unmistakable. water tanks positioned carefully, fences patched repeatedly, dirt paths leading to sheds weathered by decades of sun. While North Americans frequently interpret empty spaces as signs of decline, Australians tend to view them as natural state spaces that never sought expansion, comfort, or constant growth. The land's temperament dictates the rhythm of life, and people adapt with little ceremony. Outsiders notice how this acceptance creates an emotional climate that is neither nostalgic nor melancholic. It is simply steady, grounded by the understanding that not every place is meant to be busy or spoken about. General interactions reinforce this impression. In some towns, the local servo might remain the sole hub of activity, its shelves unevenly stocked but maintained with quiet care. A handwritten note taped to a door might announce when someone will return, back after lunch, gone to check cattle, or out on the road. These small gestures form a communication pattern built on trust and familiarity rather than precision or urgency. Americans often find these signs almost poetic, observing how they capture an entire lifestyle in a few spare words. Canadians often notice how community bonds work differently here. Connection is subtle, shaped less by frequent social events and more by shared land, shared silence, and shared resilience. Symbolic behaviors emerge as well. The slow ritual of stopping to let wildlife cross the road becomes a normal part of travel. The respectful distance kept from old structures, timber homesteads, corrugated sheds, forgotten machinery reflects an understanding that not all histories need explanation. Even the habit of offering simple, unembellished advice about heat, distance, or driving conditions reveals a cultural instinct to protect without fuss. Visitors repeatedly observe that these gestures form a quiet hospitality that doesn't announce itself but leaves a lasting impression. Over time, these traits influence the mindset of those traveling through. Many Americans discover that the vast emptiness fosters sharper self-awareness. Without distractions, thoughts sharpen and drift in new directions. Canadians often describe a shift in inner pacing, finding themselves aligning with the land's slower cadence. What stands out is how quickly the human mind adapts to an environment defined not by activity but by presence. The forgotten places become less about what is missing and more about what remains: endurance, subtle beauty, and an understated emotional clarity found far from the usual paths. Cultural transformation also echoes through the emotional climate. Many Americans discover that these spaces challenge the expectation that progress must be visible, expanding, or constantly optimized. Instead, they encounter a form of stability built on endurance. Canadians, familiar with remote northern towns, find themselves adjusting to a dryness that carries a different psychological weight, one shaped not by cold, but by heat, distance, and a kind of sun-bleached patience. In these forgotten places, people learn to read subtle cues: the direction of dust on the wind, the quiet hum of insects rising before dusk, or the muted thud of distant cattle moving across open fields. The landscape teaches attentiveness without demanding it. The longer these impressions settle, the more the forgotten places reveal their quiet significance. Rather than serving as evidence of neglect, they illustrate how a society negotiates space, history, and memory. What appears abandoned often carries a purposeful stillness, reflecting decisions shaped by geography rather than sentiment. A rusted mailbox at the edge of a dirt road suggests a life once lived at low density rather than a story of disappearance. A cricket pitch half reclaimed by grass hints not at failure, but at shifting patterns of activity. Even the solitary windmill spinning against an empty sky embodies a continuity that resists dramatic interpretation. Visitors observing these scenes often sense a deeper cultural message. In Australia, not everything is meant to be fully known or widely spoken about. This understanding leads to a final reflection shared by many Americans and Canadians after encountering these overlooked corners of the continent. The forgotten places are not merely physical locations. They are emotional spaces where silence becomes a teacher. They reveal how a land can shape the people who cross it, encouraging humility, patience, and an acceptance of what exists in the margins. And in this quiet engagement, a broader insight emerges. Every country carries landscapes that are rarely mentioned, not because they lack value, but because they hold a different kind of truth, one that speaks softly, waits calmly, and reminds those who listen that meaning often lives far from the center of attention.